Star Wars has a theological divide. This debate isn't necessarily a new phenomenon, but has become more acute in recent years. There are two camps, two patterns of thought, and at this point, two increasingly opposed groups of fans. I could make a joke here about how that is also not a new phenomenon. Star Wars fans have been battling out over various issues for years now, but this divide is quite important as it is likely to determine the future direction of the series and what it ultimately means. So, what's all this about? Debate here centers around the Force, and here I'll review some facts that are no doubt familiar to just about anyone willing to click on a Star Wars video essay. I'll start by quoting Obi-Wan: "The Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us, and binds the galaxy together." Essentially, the Force is the medium in which Star Wars exists. All living beings in the Star Wars universe live by and in the Force, with some exceptions, but I'll not talk about those today. Two diverging branches of thought can emerge from this. And to get back to my theme here, theology, one can more or less classify these branches as conservative and liberal. One is a more traditionalist view, and one is more New Age. I'll start by explaining the latter. The more liberal view of the Force is that the Force is essentially binary. There are light and dark sides to the Force itself. They are simply different ways of looking at the same thing. To relate it to a real life concept is much like the concept of God as an elephant, with various people wearing blindfolds trying to guess what it is. Each person has a different answer, but as the theory would suggest, none of them are actually wrong. They're simply looking at different aspects of the Force. There are several adherents to this line of thought in Star Wars canon and legends. Palpatine uses an argument of this sort in Episode 3, telling Anakin that one must study all the aspects of the Force in order to truly understand it. Kreia in Legends seeks to break the Force by doing both good and bad deeds. I'll admit here that I never played KOTOR 2, but I've seen video essays on it. And in the relatively new show Acolyte, which I also haven't seen, the witches in the show are depicted as not necessarily bad, just different from the Jedi. The Jedi are actually the invaders, in a sense. They come in and try to impose their will and doctrine on the witches, even killing one of them in the process. There are several outworkings of this line of thinking. First is the concept of a gray Jedi, the idea that one can practice both the light and dark sides of the Force, or at least exist somewhere in the middle. While I don't have any examples of a gray Jedi offhand, the idea would be someone who doesn't limit themselves to one line of thinking. They are able to see both sides of the Force and thus come to a greater understanding of it. Unfortunately, this doesn't tend to play out well in just about any story within Legends or canon. Anakin delves into the dark side in a desperate attempt to save his wife, only to lose both her and everything else in the process. Jason Solo is another example, who attempts to study both the light and dark. He has told the story of of the good Sith, Darth Vectimus, who did both good deeds and dark deeds and died peacefully. Basically, he was a good guy, all while using dark side practices. Unfortunately, Jason's story ultimately leads to him falling completely to the dark side and ends in his destruction. So why do we see this happening? It has to do with what I would say is the true nature of the Force. The other way to see the Force in Star Wars is more complex, but it gets at several fundamentals which are established in the movies. For example, recall the phrase, the will of the Force. What is the will of the Force, and why does it have will? The idea here is the Force is essentially made up of past Force users, past Jedi to be more specific. This is the idea of becoming one with the Force. When a Jedi dies, they are absorbed into the Force, becoming part of it and thus influencing its will. Furthermore, the will of the Force is by definition good. It is good to follow the will of the Force and conform to it. A true Jedi will act in accordance with the Force, never against it. A true Jedi is a conduit for the Force to act. So, what does that make the Sith? The Sith, or anyone who uses the dark side, are those who seek to use the Force for their own benefit. Their will, not the Force, is the primary goal. They go against the will of the Force and they seek to use it for their own gain or goals. This version of events plays out consistently in Star Wars. Sith are physically degraded by their use of the dark side. Just take a look at Palpatine, who is ravaged by the time we first see him in Episode 6. The Sith Lord Darth Nihilus loses his very body and is essentially a sort of ghost. His counterpart, Darth Sion, lives in a zombified body, forced to continue functioning by his pure will. Think of just about any Sith. Even if the dark side itself hasn't destroyed their bodies, just about all of them have lost limbs or used some sort of breathing equipment just to stay alive. Their lifestyle has led them to destruction, and these injuries are physical manifestations of those choices. Darth Vader, Darth Maul, Savage Press, Darth Malak, Darth Malgus, and even Snoke from the new trilogy all use some kind of all have some kind of physical injury. There are exceptions, of course. One example is the Night Sisters. However, their practices, while not physically destructive, are still unnatural in a way that reveals their sinister nature. In her quest to acquire an apprentice, Asajj Ventress slaughters several Zabrak warriors in a brutal competition. She then participates in a ritual to strengthen her new apprentice, turning him into a hulking monster who kills his own brother when he wakes up. The matriarch of the Night Sisters participates in voodoo magic in an attempt to kill Count Dooku. She also creates a zombie horde in the same episode, using the dead bodies of her people to fight off an impending invasion. Certainly, this is a form of self-defense, but it doesn't make it any less unnatural. It's likely evident where I fall in this debate. I would lean towards the traditional view as the correct one, which is not to say there is actually only one that is canonically valid. In the Mortis arc of the Clone Wars, a show I love to this day, the light and dark duality is clearly the view presented, though the dark still seems to be inherently evil. You can make a case for either view depending on how the evidence is presented. My primary concern here is which view future authors will take. To put it simply, you can only have one or the other. There isn't a good compromise between these two. The Sith must be always evil, or simply another perspective. The Night Sisters likewise must be inherently evil and corrupt by their ideals, or they can just be another branch of ideology. You can make the argument that the Jedi were corrupt. I can certainly agree with this during the time of the Clone Wars. But if you argue for a type of moral equivalence between the two, you end up with a story unable to tell a coherent moral story. The Jedi ideology, when lived out consistently, must be inherently good for the story to make sense. And why is this? Well, for this, we must go back to the original trilogy. What do we see when it's told through Luke's eyes? Well, Luke is almost immediately awoken to the evils of the Empire, an empire led by Darth Sidious, the ultimate dark side user. He must take on the mantle of Jedi to fight this evil, and we see him learn what it means in the second episode. He trains, confronts the dark side within himself, and comes face to face with his greatest fears. And he turns down the offer of a lifetime. And think about it. Why shouldn't he have taken Vader's offer in episode 5? I could be mistaken about this, but I fully believe Darth Vader was serious about overthrowing the Emperor and ruling the galaxy. They likely could have done it too. Why not? Luke could have built a prosperous realm, and perhaps together they may have plotted a better path forward for the galaxy, just the two of them. Surely Luke could have done more good at the head of the Empire, rather than as a rebel on the run. So why would he turn down this offer? Luke knows, perhaps subconsciously, that the power he would gain by ruling the Empire would lead to the dark side. In the cave on Dagobah, saw what could happen to him if he went down the path his father did. There was a Vader in him as well, and the dark side would lead him there. Following Vader could only turn him into Vader. And we see his concerns ultimately validated when he redeems his father in Episode 6. Vader's redemption isn't just a rejection of the Emperor's ideology or even of the Emperor himself. Anakin's Force Ghost wears the robes of a Jedi. And in striking down the Emperor, Anakin fulfills the Jedi prophecy of the Chosen One. He brings balance to the Force by wiping out the embodiment of the dark side. Much more can be said on the prophecy of the Chosen One, and I may say more on that in a separate video in the future. But suffice to say that Star Wars was built on this traditional view of the Force. So, what happens if it changes this view moving forward? What we end up with is an incongruent story, for one, and the sequel trilogy has shown us what happens with incongruent stories. But on top of this, we end up with a story where everything we are told up through the first 6 movies is thrown into question. Already we have a situation where Vader's redemption is devalued, the Emperor returned, after all. But if Star Wars continues down this path, it will become questionable whether Luke is the good guy to begin with. There's a theory out there on the internet of Palpatine the Good. The idea that everything he did was ultimately to bring good to the galaxy, or at least stability. In Legends, we also have the Yuzang Vong threat, and the idea that Palpatine was preparing for their arrival by militarizing the galaxy. Now, how many people take this seriously is debatable, but we do see here the ultimate logic of not holding to a strict good and evil perspective on the Force. I do have more to say on this, but I'd like to hear more feedback on this first. I know I have weaknesses in this argument, and I'd like to hammer them out and see what ground I haven't covered. Go ahead and leave your feedback in the comments, let me know what I missed, and perhaps what you agree with. In any case, that's all I have for you today. Thanks for listening, and press on.